Story 1. We used to build forts in the woods, bridges across creeks, travel to the lake to go swimming, and play at the park. I loved being outdoors whenever I could. I spent weeks with my friends building a soapbox racer, only to realize when we finished that there were no good hills near our houses. Story 2. I had a bicycle, and I left in the morning and came back for dinner. We lived in a master-planned community in a small-town suburb, but there were no rules about where I could and could not go. That was from the time I was about 6 years old. I remember being convinced that the safest place for me to be on my bicycle was the center line because if a car was coming from one direction, I would veer into the other lane. If a car was coming from the opposite direction, I would veer into the opposite lane. It worked well until cars came from both directions at the same time, but I was only 6. I am amazed any of us lived to tell the story. Story 3. A bit different because we had a farm. I started driving the tractor by myself as soon as I could hold down the clutch, which for me, a girl, was in 6th grade. I drove that tractor like it was a car, visiting my relatives up the road and such. The tractor I am using again is from the 1960s. Story 4. At age 9, I remember my mom letting me ride my bike to my grandfather's house 3.5 miles away. The route was mainly traffic-filled streets, not sidewalks. My little self, with my cute pink and white bike with streamers on the handles and matching helmet, just trucking it to Pop-Pops without a care in the world. How I didn't get kidnapped, I have no idea. Story 5. I loved just hanging out in the woods. I was born in 1980, and not only were kids free roaming, but dogs also were. A group of dogs would meet kids by the bus stop. It was not uncommon for my friend's mom to have their dog walk me home if I was walking at night, and then the dog would just drop me off and go back. I lived in the suburbs, not the country. Dogs also defecated on your lawn. No one had plastic bags. It was part of living in a neighborhood. Your window might get broken from an errant baseball pitch. A dog would defecate on your lawn. Whatever. If you did not like it, you moved to the country or something. Story 6. Rode bikes to abandoned houses, junkyards, a pool, or someone else's house where the parents were not home. Then proceeded to exchange wisdom and misinformation that would take years to sort out. Story 7. I was really good at catching crawdads. I would lift up a big rock, knowing they were under it, have my big cup already underwater, put the cup behind them, and scare them to swim backwards into the cup with a stick. I was a tomboy and now I am very girly. Story 8. Not necessarily an activity, but my dad doing his whistle when dinner was done. I could be a neighborhood away, and I would hear that whistle and just turn to my friends and say, "Yo, I have to go." Story 9. Going to the corner store with $2 to buy milk and bread, or a missing ingredient for dinner at 6 or 7. Not only are people unlikely to have cash, but there are hardly any corner groceries in neighborhoods anymore, at least in the city I live in. If there were, a child would get stopped and held while concerned people call the police. My parents were also known as strict, and I often had friends amazed that I couldn't go to their house without telling my parents where I was going. At the age of 8 or 9, I informed my parents where I would be and when I would be back. Story 10. Catching the last 2 or 3 innings of a Chicago Cubs game after school let out. Daytime baseball, nothing like it anymore. Story 11. Nothing terrible happened. We rode bikes, bought candy at the store, and chased ice cream trucks. We just were not supervised, but we were afraid of our parents, so we did not do anything bad. Story 12. Rode my bicycle, played hide and seek with the neighborhood children. Went downtown with friends after school or on weekends. Story 13. My younger sister and I, starting around ages 3 and 6 respectively, would load up a wagon and walk 1 mile to the beach. We would spend the entire day there alone, then pack up and head home when the sun was setting. We probably had about a 3-mile radius in our town where we would go to a general store, turn in cans for some candy money, go fishing, and so on. Looking back on it now, I cannot believe we were allowed to do that and that we survived all the risky things we did. Story 14. Allowed to ride the city bus by myself to the downtown library or ride my bike if I felt up to it. I constantly walked my dogs alone on public walking paths or nature trails. There were known kidnappings and killings on these trails, as well as drug-addicted homeless people. I was left home alone most of the time. I was expected to get myself up and ready for school, including making my lunch, as there were no school-provided lunches for me. Summers were fantastic, having the house to myself all day. Other kids could afford summer camps or activities, so I usually spent most of my time on my computer, also completely unsupervised. For any sports or activities after school, I was usually dropped off until I was old enough to drive. Sometimes I had to ask someone else for a ride, and my parents usually did not know with whom until after the fact. It is amazing that I did not get into some really bad situations. Somehow, I had the instinct to get out of the dangerous situations I nearly ended up in. Story 15. At 6 years old and onward, I went to the woods alone and wandered around by myself. Now that I am an adult, I have to wonder if my parents disliked me or something. Although it was my choice to do it for hours, who lets their small children do that? Story 16. Riding my bike wherever. Singing to myself with no one listening. There was a green belt with a swamp system near my house, so I would catch tadpoles and make a tank for them in the backyard and watch them become frogs. I ate way too much candy, but I was burning that off anyway. Pick up basketball games at the park. I don't know, the 1980s and 1990s were great. Being a kid now feels like it might be kind of boring. Story 17. In the early 1970s, there was a large cleared field just east of my home. Across the railroad tracks, about 200 acres of land had been cleared for building houses, but no construction was underway. It must have been a downturn in the housing market. My friends and I built a complex model rocket launching facility and used it for a few years. Once, a botched launch started a grass fire that resulted in a fire department response. We quickly left the area. I'm not sure my parents ever knew what we were doing. Story 18. I grew up in the country, so it was different from city life. Out there, no one locked their doors, and all the kids knew that if you needed help, just go knock on a door and ask for it. I started riding my bike around the area alone as early as 6 or 7. I played in the forest, built tree houses, ice skated on the pond, helped plug holes in the beaver dam, and started shooting bow and arrow around 8 or 9. The only thing we never did was ride all-terrain vehicles or dirt bikes. Story 19. We found ourselves catching wild animals, digging holes, and exploring. Some notable experiences include where there is currently a Walmart superstore used to be a swamp full of wildlife. I have fond memories of following the banks of a very small river and catching garter snakes there all the time. I also remember that on the other side of the highway adjacent, we would catch frogs in a farmer's field, which is now a Canadian Tire, Tim Hortons, McDonald's, Boston Pizza, a no-frills grocery store, and a gas station. We would light candles and lie on skateboards in massive storm drainage pipes, rolling around and exploring. It is now a school, a subdivision, and a wildlife conservation area. Ironically, we also caught frogs here all the time, and we dug forts into the sides of the dirt piles before it was all developed. We used to chase rabbits until they gave up and then haul them home to our parents. I am shocked no one realized we had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder until 25 years later. Story 20. Kids today are so overcommit that they do not even understand what a free evening feels like. It is sad. Story 21. My sister and I would hang out with the neighborhood kids, climbing building roofs or trees. We walked around to different neighborhoods just for fun, playing in random parks. This was in the early 2000s. When streetlights came on, you knew it was time to make your way home. We also had no house or apartment keys, so we would have to wait for a parent to come home or find a way into our own or a friend's house. Story 22. Had a bike, would travel. Local parks, streams, cattle pastures. We would build forts, catch minnows or crawdads, go to the convenience store if we actually had an allowance for a Slurpee, $1.50 matinees at the local movie theater. Or just crash at someone's house to play Nintendo or play slip and slide, which was a tarp with a hose. Story 23. I used to ride my bicycle to the corner store about 3 miles away and buy candy. My friends and I also rode our bicycles all over town and played in the woods. Story 24. We explored everything. Any building, any woods, any drainage tunnel, any church, any place without an adult to tell us no. We cut through fenced yards and climbed neighbors' trees. We built bike ramps and road elevators to the top. We climbed onto the roofs of our schools and power towers and radio towers. We outran police through drainage tunnels by climbing through connecting tunnels and going silent. Good times. Story 25. I am a child of the 1950s and 1960s. We built a large raft, approximately 8 by 8 feet, entirely without adult supervision. Story 26. I was born in 1989, so I was late to this party, but I had a lot of freedom as a kid, roaming the drainage ditch behind my mother's house. My son is almost 7, and I seem to be the only parent in my neighborhood who lets him go out on his own, on his bike or on foot. No phone, just boundaries, and he knows to come running when I whistle loudly. Story 27. Swam, biked, picked random berries, read a lot after biking somewhere, then biked more. The bike culture was real and not at all fancy gear-wise. No helmet was worn, even when biking on city streets. Story 28. Aside from actual Stranger Things, the television series Stranger Things does a great job portraying what it was like growing up then. Story 29. We took slingshots, BB guns, machetes, and knives into the cornfield, woods, and islands, small groups of trees and bushes in the middle of the cornfields, and just did kid activities. We built forts, explored, joked, and fought. This was in the late 1980s and 1990s in an area where suburbs were built up along and around a line of undeveloped land. One island was called Playboy Island because some kids found a Playboy magazine there once. Another was called Airplane Island because it only had low bushes and no cover. Others were simply called First Island or Third Island. It was magical. Story 30. My best friend and I would pack a lunch and ride our bikes to the city wave pool, stay there all day, then go home for dinner. Story 31. I remember before the age of 10 being able to go to almost any part of the city I lived in by bike. To be fair, we carried enough money to take the bus if needed, such as in case of a flat tire. By the age of 13, I was taking the train all the way through Boston and using the commuter rail to visit aunts and uncles on my own. I also had tools that I don't think kids have now, like wood-burning tools and soldering irons. Story 32. Put sun in my hair and chill with the girls next to the sprinkler we set up. I think sun-in has been outlawed because too many mothers complained about having to color correct their children's orange hair. Story 33. Playing in the woods and injuring my wrist on a tree in a gully. Not that it couldn't happen, but I can't see many parents letting kids get into that situation. But hey, I know exactly what a tendon inside the body looks like, firsthand. Story 34. We just rode our bikes to get places all the time instead of getting rides. Particularly in the summer, I would ride my bike about 5 miles to camp. When I was 7 or 8, my mom and the neighbor's mom had to leave for work before the bus came. They would leave the two of us together watching cartoons with the stove timer on. It was our responsibility to lock up behind us and walk to the bus stop on time. Story 35. I used to go door to door in our neighborhood dragging a push mower, gas can, and thermos full of sweet iced tea with me. I would cut yards all day long. My parents told me to be careful and never question me. I was 10 or 11 years old. Story 36. When I was still in single digits or in early middle school, I could just walk to my friend's house a couple of miles away as long as I told them where I was going. Then my friend and I could roam around as much as we wanted, as long as I got back to his place, mine, before dark. This was the 1990s. Story 37. Start wars with the children who lived on the other side of the creek in my backyard. Water balloons filled with rocks were a common weapon. It did not matter who hit whom, nobody told their parents. Story 38. I was a latchkey kid in the late 90s and early 2000s. I remember when we moved back in with my dad, he didn't want to move us from another elementary school, so we still went to the one close to my mom's. He'd be off to work in the mornings around 6:30, and we'd get up, shower, drink the smoothies he'd make us for breakfast, and go hop out for the middle school bus. Middle schoolers got off about 45 minutes earlier than us, so Dad would pick us up after work. On the weeks when he worked night shift, he would bike with us to the school in the mornings, and I'd be responsible for biking back. My grandmother would come stay with us when he worked night shift, but she didn't drive. I was 8. We had to grow up really quickly. But my dad did the absolute best he could for us, and I miss him every day. Story 39. Walk 20 minutes to a playground far away by myself. Stay there until it got dark, then head home. I was in second grade. Story 40. We used to take our bicycles and see how far up the small river or stream in our neighborhood we could travel. We would go out for the entire day and get well outside the city limits. Then we would turn around and come back. We did this multiple times for different rivers. One summer, we carried all the wood from a fence my father replaced and built a fort in the local wooded area. The fort lasted for several summers until we lost interest in it. At the height of the skateboard craze in the 1980s, we found an old abandoned house with a pool. We cleaned it up and turned it into a skate pool. Story 41. Lived next to the Santa Ana River, and we used to spend all day down in the river bottom dressed in camouflage and playing with toy guns painted black with no orange tip. No phones, no thought about snacks or water, just us, our imaginations, and our ignorance. Story 42. I grew up in a rural area, so I used to ride my bicycle 5 miles on very hilly country roads with no sidewalks or shoulders and many semi-trucks traveling up and down them. I went into town to the library, where the librarian did not care about what I was reading or checking out. It could have been anything, and no one in the area was concerned about the types of books the library had. I left my house in the morning and did not return until dusk. No one knew where I was or what I was doing. I was never doing anything bad or reading anything inappropriate, but that is beside the point. Now, every busybody in town feels compelled to monitor the library and what children, who are not theirs, are reading. Additionally, children today do not have the freedom to roam and develop independence. Story 43. I lived in a small Canadian town in the late 1970s, between the ages of 7 and 10. I remember being allowed to roam freely while both parents worked full-time on weekdays. I would walk a couple of kilometers to the nearest lake to fish after school, making sure to be home in time for dinner. On weekends, I spent time in the woods, as we lived on the edge of the wilderness. I enjoyed bike riding and catching snakes. There were bears, cougars, and wolves in the area, but my mother was more concerned about grow shows run by the Hells Angels, who had a chapter in town and a clubhouse in our neighborhood. She taught me how to spot booby traps. The only rule on weekends was to be home before the streetlights came on. I feel sorry for kids today. Most do not have that kind of freedom and independence and are constantly monitored by their parents through cell phones. Story 44. I grew up next to the Green River. I used to play on the banks and in the river by myself for hours when I was 8 to 10 years old. 20 years later, my mother would not let her grandchildren anywhere near that river without constant supervision, and even then they were not allowed to go in. This was not because of the Green River Killer, as we were not in that part of the river. It was because if they got within 50 feet of the water without someone holding their hands, they might suddenly drown. Story 45. Going down to the creek behind the neighborhood to look for crystals, which are usually rocks with bits of quartz in them, and frogs. We occasionally saw homeless people there, but they never bothered us. Epic games of hide and seek with all the kids in the neighborhood. Trying to do cool tricks on our bikes or roller skates. I got scraped up pretty badly one time, but no broken bones or anything major. Playing ding-dong ditch. Everyone has cameras now, so you can't do that. The rest of it is less likely because apparently allowing your kids to be out of your direct line of vision for any length of time is criminalized now. Story 46. Avoided any place that looked like it could have quicksand. Funny enough, I fell through the ice, so half-frozen ponds never scared me. I used to watch Rescue 9/11. Story 47. Played in the woods, built dams across the creek, rode our bicycles, built ramps and jumped our bicycles, went to the library, swam in the summer during the 1970s. Story 48. Lived on an island. We would roam around looking for abandoned house foundations in the woods and poke at all the weathered corn stashes with sticks. Just a small group of elementary school-aged girls having some good, wholesome fun. Story 49. During the summer, we would ride bikes to the little country store and gas station, get snacks, and play Altered Beast. Then we might grab a movie rental and bike home. Story 50. My family got into archery in the 1970s. We lived across the street from my elementary school. The school was on a rise, so there was a tall dirt bank directly across the street from our house. We put hay bales at the base of the dirt bank with targets on them. Then I would shoot from our front yard across the street at the targets at the base of the bank. My grade school was on top of that embankment. Nobody ever said anything about it, not even the occasional police officer who would drive by between us and the targets. Story 51. We lived on a quiet street in the suburbs on a hill. We played with the neighbors' kids either in front of the house or at the top of the cul-de-sac where it was flat. 40-40 was a popular game, or kicking a football, but sometimes we would just lie down in the middle of the road or climb onto the electricity box and talk. At one point, we had a war with the kids up the street, but it didn't last long, and we were friends again afterwards. Mud pies were fun. We played under the sprinkler in summer. Sometimes we went to the milk bar to buy lollies, and there was a park on the way to play in, or we would ride bikes down to the main road. We weren't allowed to cross it, so we would ride back. There was a huge floodplain as well, so sometimes we explored down there. We never found anything too fun except signs of homeless people sleeping under the bridge. We just stayed away from that part. Story 52. I went into town with my friends in elementary school with no adult supervision. My parents had a charge account at a small grocery store there. I had gone with them enough to just give the last name and watch them add the purchase to that account. They wondered why they had a few transactions with just a Kit Kat when they got their bill. Story 53. We would ride our bicycles everywhere, to friends' houses, parks, and down to the river. Sometimes we would have jellyfish fights with the large, stingless river jellyfish. Story 54. After school, I watched Tiny Toon Adventures, then Batman, the animated series. Afterwards, I read comics or books and listened to music until my parents came home from work. Story 55. Born in 1978. I remember around age 10 to 12 the unbridled joy of sneaking out during a sleepover. It was just the kids down the street, but seeing my neighborhood in the dark and going to familiar areas in a new light, knowing we could get in trouble if we got caught, was thrilling. In hindsight, it was kind of innocent. Story 56. Rode my bicycle everywhere alone. Walked to school if I missed the bus. 3 miles across a highway. Climbed every tree. Cooked dinners at 8 o'clock with no supervision. Story 57. Make up plot lines and pretend we were characters from the Alpha Team or Star Wars, then run all over town enacting them. In people's yards, in the churchyard, in the woods, the town was our playground. Story 58. Get on your bike and look for the house with a group of bikes in the yard because that is where everyone else was. In my family, we had to tape a note to the fridge if we left the house. One time, I got off the bus at my friend's stop and walked home with her. Since I had not had time to go home, there was no note about where I was. I was not allowed anywhere after school for 2 weeks. Always leave a note. Story 59. 70's child biked everywhere. Ran creeks in the woods. Looked for snakes, salamanders, crawdads, frogs, and duck eggs. Fished with cane poles and visited the bookmobile in summers, which parked in my neighborhood. Took the Young Men's Christian Association bus to the air-conditioned movies to watch 5 hours of cartoons and kids' movies. Swam and played Marco Polo at the pool after biking, barely able to bike home afterward. Caught fireflies at dusk. Ripped every back pocket off my shorts from jumping fences. Read. Stayed far away from my older teenage sisters who babysat me in summers. Story 60. I lived in a really small town. If I did something very bad, my mother would know about it before I got home for dinner. Story 61. We had a game called Cross Country. We saw how many consecutive backyard fences we could hop throughout the neighborhood before we inevitably ran into one of the homeowners who would yell at us until we ran away. Story 62. We were in a growing neighborhood with lots of new construction and many houses where the framing was done and plywood was up. But there was a lull before they sealed the house with windows, doors, and Tyvek. We did a lot of exploring houses, never stole or vandalized anything, just played soldiers in the houses or sometimes on the big mounds of dirt they dug out for basements. Story 63. Played in the woods all day after chores until sunset. That included railroad tracks and areas under freeways and overpasses. Story 64. We would bike to the local swimming pool and come home when we got hungry. Hours were spent there, and the only adults were the lifeguards. Story 65. My sister and I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado. The houses all had alleys behind them. We used to get on our bikes and ride down the alleys for hours, then head over to City Park and hang out in the forest, as we called it, really just a couple dozen big pine trees. We would ride into downtown and stop at the local state wildlife office to get junior forest ranger badges, often not heading back home until dinner time. Then, with towels tied around our necks like capes, we would be Batman and Robin on our bikes and ride around. Story 66. I holed up in my room and read any book I could get my hands on. My grandmother started giving me all her V.C. Andrew's books after she finished reading them. I had absolutely no business reading Flowers in the Attic at 10 years old. Story 67. I lived on a corner lot. Our play constantly bled over into the neighbors' yards. They never complained as long as we did not tear up their yard. Nowadays, there are too many people calling Child Protective Services for abandoned children who are just playing outside. Story 68. I live across the street from a large hill that is heavily wooded. If you climb up some rocks and a pretty steep hill, which is not horribly difficult, but I wouldn't do it now, you reach more woods and rocky areas, and eventually some people's backyards. It is basically a western Pennsylvania mountain. We called it the mountain, and the entire entrance was covered with bamboo, so you had to make your way through it. My friends and I would spend a lot of time up there alone. 2 or 3 little girls alone on a forested mountain, where we weren't visible to anyone. I used to go up there by myself to sit on this throne, a rock formation that looked like a big chair, and read. I would take accessories. Now I live in this house, and I think I would never let my son go up there, even though those are some of my happiest memories. Thankfully, nothing ever happened to us besides finding empty beer bottles sometimes, which also horrifies me to think about what could have happened. Not just who we could have come across in the woods, but that we literally could have fallen down a cliff. I actually had awesome parents, though. I was very lucky. Story 69. I would leave after breakfast in the warm months and often not come home until supper. We lived in a small town, so there were endless things to do. We fought, swam in sloughs, biked, hiked, and raided gardens. Everyone knew everyone, so it was pretty hard not to get caught messing up. Story 70. From 3rd through 6th grade, my friends and I would leave the house at 10 a.m., bike to the pool with a packed lunch, and stay there until 5 or 6 p.m. My mom was at work, and my friends were the youngest in a very large family, so they were not allowed in the house unless it was raining. We played outside all day during summer break, which lasted all of June, July, and August. Story 71. In the summer, my friends and I would disappear on our bicycles from dawn to dusk. I was between the ages of 5 and 8. It helped that we lived on a military base at the time. We transferred bases when I was 8. I still went out on my bicycle but did not initially have any friends nearby. Story 72. My cousins, friends, and I were allowed to wander around the woods for hours. Once we became preteens, we were allowed to drive four-wheelers throughout the woods, not wearing helmets, of course. Story 73. Bikes all over the place with our bicycle motocross bikes. Skateboard day and night. Had to be home for dinner every night, then could go back out until the street lights came on. Story 74. I think this was even extreme for latchkey children, but I grew up in a trailer park in rural Arkansas. I was told I was crazy for being able to do this as a child. I would come home early at about 11 years old, get a rifle from the cabinet, and my friends and I would go shoot random things on the land our park was on until our parents came home and made us do chores. Story 75. Ride bikes all over town. I lived by the woods and we had forts. We basically had the entire forest memorized. To this day, I can navigate through it well. Story 76. Riding BMX everywhere. Setting up ramps to jump over friends lying on the ground. We thought we were Evel Knievel. I am surprised no one died. Story 77. I walked by myself or sometimes with my siblings to school and back home, about 5 blocks away, and had to cross a busy street. For after-school activities or summers, since our parents could not afford vacations for 5 children, we would roam or bike around, skateboard, play tennis or hockey depending on the season, or hang out at the mall. I knew children who carried their hockey sticks with them and joined games at random locations in the neighborhood. Story 78. I don't know what parental supervision is like these days, but basically from the age I was old enough to operate a bicycle without crashing and needing an adult, the world was my oyster. Home for dinner. Story 79. Late 1970s to 1980s Southern California. Hung out with friends. Everyone's parents were working and not home until at least 6, usually later. Rarely saw them. Rode bikes, skateboard, played organized sports if your family could afford it, tried to avoid bullies, rode fast to get away from friends who said they were going to steal my bike if they caught me, smoked cigarettes, dated girls who were interested, drank too much and passed out on lawns, played Atari 2600 and ColecoVision when we could. But most kids who had them were spoiled when those consoles first came out. A friend's older brother was into weed and guitar, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, Iron Maiden, Rush, good times. Then I came home and made dinner for my younger brother since my parents were working. We didn't all survive, but survival is not guaranteed now either. We had agency, and the ability to make mistakes and move past them was normal. We didn't have phones or social media, so nothing was recorded, and there is no proof of what we did except for sealed court records that were destroyed decades ago. Story 80. We played tag with our BB guns and air rifles. We could not afford paintball, so we all agreed on no more than 5 pumps and no headshots. We wore long sleeves and played in a nearby rock quarry. Good times. Story 81. I feel the need to specify that latchkey kids do not mean being free to roam the neighborhood. A latchkey kid is one who comes home to an empty house because both of their parents worked. My mom was a stay-at-home parent, so I was not a latchkey. I did roam the neighborhood, though. Story 82. Roaming the streets then was like browsing Netflix today. You would go down the street, see some other kids that you knew, find out they were playing hockey, soccer, riding their bikes, going to rent a video game or whatever, and then just join in. Story 83. They would be much less likely to be allowed to get off the school bus, apparently, from what I hear. Crazy. Story 84. Getting lost in the woods. I would go out with a pellet BB gun and plink Coca-Cola cans for hours. I would trek the woods in search of nothing but a deeper appreciation for the great outdoors. I would climb trees, play in streams, find old hunting stands, and more. Story 85. In summer, every day was like an odyssey. You would call your friend's house to see if they were around. If they were not, you had to find them. How? You got on your bike and visited all of the likely spots, engaging with whoever was there until you found the person you were originally looking for. You might find them right away, or it might take a while. Sometimes you encountered creepy people, and sometimes you experienced a little adventure that, as an adult, you realized definitely could have been dangerous. Story 86. We were in a subdivision still under development. We went dumpster diving for plywood and nails at the construction site because we wanted to build a treehouse, but our mother absolutely refused to let us use her new nails. We never did build that treehouse, but we found a treehouse that someone else had built in the forest and seemingly abandoned. We shingled its roof with cast-offs from the same construction site. Story 87. I once rode my bicycle 20 miles to the nearest city and back just to see if I could. I managed to get back by dark, but it was foolish and extremely dangerous in hindsight. Story 88. My friend and I rode my aunt's horse without a saddle or bridle. Oddly, he chose to buck us off into oblivion. Story 89. We stole an axe from one of our fathers to walk into the woods and cut down trees to make a fort. We were about 10 years old. Story 90. Doing whatever I wanted inside the house until my parents came home was great. No one knew what I was up to as long as the house was clean when they got home. Now, parents have those nanny cameras everywhere. Story 91. Pretty much the same activities that latchkey children do now, except that back then it was the norm rather than the exception. I think the big difference is that latchkey children today at least have a cell phone, which we did not have in the past. I spent my days using drugs with friends early in the day and then sobering up before going home. I am sure my parents were aware. Story 92. I grew up in the early 2000s but was allowed to freely roam my bicycle around town. I went to the public pool or I would get ice cream and watch the trains go by. There was a local bicycle motocross track connected to the skate park, so we did that. Sometimes we would ride our bicycles along the irrigation canals to see the cows. Story 93. I spent my entire life as a latchkey kid. In the summer, I used to get on my bike in the morning, ride wherever I wanted, stop by a friend's house, and just knock and come in because you could not call before you got there. You were on your own most of the time. I got into a lot of trouble with that freedom. Story 94. Night knock. Yes, it was called that. Merely reporting. Toileting trees. Egging cars. Stealing hood ornaments. More wholesome. Baseball games, one neighborhood versus another neighborhood. Story 95. I grew up in Florida, and we had stormwater sewers that ran all over the area. My brother, friends, and I used to crawl through them and end up in different neighborhoods. They led to large ditches in various parts of the area. One ditch in particular was a place where we would hang out. One time, my brother and I started a small fire in the tall grass. It got out of control and the entire football field-sized ditch caught fire. No one was hurt and we never got caught. Story 96. Exactly as you said. Medicine cabinets were unlocked and many items were taken from when I was 8 years old onward. Edit 1967 to 1985. Story 97. I walked, rode my bike, or skateboard to school every day starting in grade 1. Parents walked with me the first day. After that, I walked with the next-door kids or by myself. This was in one of Canada's largest cities and in a challenging neighborhood. When I turned 12, I was expected to look after myself after school until my mother got home around 6. At age 13, I was expected to have dinner ready when they arrived home. Story 98. I made homemade gunpowder and flash pots, slowly creating 10-pound fireball, ammonium nitrate fuel oil, and fuel air displays on the local sandbar for July 4th. I sent up a 30-foot fireball that scared me enough to never do it again. Story 99. Walked home from school, walked to convenience stores for snacks, stayed at home at ages 6 and 7 by ourselves until parents came home, rode bikes and stayed out until it was dark. Parents would drop us off for matinee specials that cost 50 cents. We would be by ourselves, watch double features, and then walk across to the mall. Story 100. Outside all day, either playing in the woods or football and baseball in the street, or huge games of tag. Friends of friends would ride their bikes over to play. I grew up on a dead-end street surrounded by redwoods. We were the neighborhood everyone came to play in, also riding bikes all over town. Story 101. In the 1960s and 1970s, there were children everywhere, boys riding bicycles and girls relaxing on lawns. The 1980s stranger danger phenomenon put an end to it, followed by the helicopter parenting of today. Story 102. I walked to 2nd and 3rd grade school a mile through the fields. Then, in 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, I rode my bike 6 miles to school and back. This was in the mid-1970s. Story 103. All day? Sometimes I would leave the house at 3 in the morning and go head to the park or wander the neighborhood. Story 104. My friends from elementary school and I shot fireworks into someone's house and accidentally burned it down. I suppose it wasn't truly an accident since we intentionally shot the fireworks, but at that age, none of us fully understood the consequences of shooting fireworks and causing a fire. Story 105. Spray painted under bridges. Drank beer. Rode bicycles around. Smoked cannabis. Explored random abandoned buildings. Kissed girls. Made forts. Got beaten up at the skate park. Story 106. Rode bikes, played hockey in winter and baseball in summer, wandered around getting into trouble, gathered at someone's house to play Super Nintendo, went to the city pool to watch the lifeguards like little creeps, and did pretty much whatever we wanted. I would leave the house in the morning, come home for dinner, then be back out until dark. The 1990s are where humanity peaked. Sorry, kids. Story 107. We biked all over the place, miles and miles away. We had woods near us, so we walked down the road with our pellet guns to the woods where we shot at toss bottles, cans, each other, and trees. Story 108. Playing hide and seek with 40 children. We made it a team game and used the entire neighborhood to hide. I think if people saw that many children running around today, they would call the police. Story 109. Any kind of mischief we could get into, but generally speaking, just be out and about. Discover things. It was not like kids were out committing serious crimes. Most of the time, just looking for other kids to hang out with and try not to get harmed. Even then, it was not like nobody knew about those men or women for that matter. I cannot even get my kids to get out of the house. I wish they would get into a little trouble. Learn a few things the hard way so it will stick. Story 110. Just coming home so dirty after being outside all day. Our parents had no idea what we did or where we were. We were all just outside. Story 111. When I was a little kid, I would play around on construction sites. I am glad I did not accidentally weld my feet together or something. Story 112. We spent all day riding our bicycles everywhere and played jailbreak in the woods at night entirely unsupervised. Story 113. I don't live in the same kind of neighborhood that I did as a kid, nor do I live in a sleepy suburban town anymore, but in a major city. I don't see many kids playing street hockey or driveway basketball anymore. Story 114. Built ramps and other contraptions out of whatever was left on the curb for large trash pickup. Jumping and flipping off ramps, houses, sheds, transformers, and more. Monkey ball wars. For clarity, monkey balls are spiky balls that fall from large trees in the south. Going swimming in any body of water deep enough to swim in. Going inside the candy lady's house to get snacks and candy. I'm pretty sure all of us sticking our arms elbow deep into the pickle jar is why I have such a robust immune system. Jumping the fence to the baseball field and turning on all the lights to play kickball. All while riding someone's handlebars or pegs. Story 115. Hop on the city bus in the middle of the day for 35 cents and just ride it around the same loop, and eventually get off at the same stop I got on at, simply because I did not want to be at home and had nowhere else to go. Story 116. We lived a block away from my high school, so we would ride bikes and hang out there a lot. We made prank phone calls on their payphone. There was a nice bump to do bike jumps off of. My favorite thing was during track season when they had the pole vaulting mat out. We put a 2x4 on an upside-down trash can. My cousin would jump on one end to launch the others onto the mat. We played a lot of hide and seek at night too. The whole street was open, and the fire hydrant in the middle was home base. There were 11 of us within a 5-year age range. Story 117. My mom had no choice but to let me get home by myself in middle school. It was about 2 miles from where I lived, and every afternoon my 2 best friends and I would walk back home from school through the train tracks. Story 118. I followed a stream under highways and eventually reached an area that may have been some kind of waste management. I don't think that was mud. I followed a creek and did a little hiking in the steep hills next to it. I fell off a short cliff, landed on my tailbone, and made jokes about it being a pain as my body shook uncontrollably. I rode bikes far enough away that it would have taken a few hours to be picked up by car. I climbed through various construction sites. Once, my brother ripped his stomach open on a rebar sticking out of some concrete because he didn't maneuver around it like I had demonstrated and was unscathed. Another time, I landed on a nail sticking straight up and it went into my foot. Another time, my brother jumped from roof to roof. He was fine until my dad punished him. Story 119. We had a network of storm drains that could easily be accessed and explored. I remember the first time one of us had a flashlight, because we used to use candles to light our way. One day, we decided to go really far, so we brought something to write on to map our way and not get lost. We used crayons. Story 120. I ended up getting in a fight with another girl. We just threw things at each other like sticks until we heard the siren of a police car. Then the girl, 7 other kids, and I all scattered and I rode home on my bike. I never told a soul until years later. Normally, I just went to friends' houses, which is what I was supposed to be doing when the fight happened, or played in the street. Story 121. I would walk the trails through the woods to the library and back all by myself. The worst thing to ever happen was a creepy man in a trench coat. Story 122. Riding my bicycle with my friends to the local Quickie Mart for 50-cent 40-ounce fountain sodas. Riding our bicycles 6 miles to the mall. Riding our bicycles to the movie theater and then home. Playing ditch them late at night. Story 123. I once got trapped in an irrigation well. I just climbed in there for fun when I was about 7 years old. Fortunately, it was dry, but I was trapped for hours until the neighbor heard me crying for help. When I got home, I told my mother. She shrugged her shoulders and said she was glad I was okay. Life went on. Story 124. We always did adventures like Stand By Me journeys on weekends. We had a little sewer city where we also hung out. It was a huge runoff basin for a new housing development that had not been built yet. The sewers were pretty big, at least they seemed that way to a 7-year-old. They connected with another housing development's sewer tunnels and then went somewhere. We explored further and further each time, taking different routes. This was the outer edge of suburbia at the time, which ran into wooded areas, farms, or a random highway. One tunnel went through a swamp, or at least that is how my brain interpreted it. A couple of years later, my older sister would not go anymore. I thought she was too big or too cool. Now, she realized that some of those were waste pipes draining in, and the swamp was likely filled with God knows what. There were a lot of worms and equally horrible things in it. I cannot believe that none of us got horrible diseases or infections. We were covered in scratches from crawling in the small tunnels and pipes. We loved the adventures and the crazy animals, insects, and rodents we would find. We thought we were like the Beastmaster until the older kids told us otherwise. Then we spent our weekends throwing rocks at each other. Story 125. A combination of going outside to visit my friends and spending a lot of time watching movies and television shows. The habit that has lasted until today. I am a library of anime, movies, and television shows. I am the person people come to for recommendations. Story 126. I walked to the lake a mile from my house during the summer with my neighbor friend. We built a Ninja Turtle city behind the lake where the overflow created a cool creek down in the woods. I think I was 9 or 10. This was one of the safer things we did. I drove my dirt bike to the next town over following the trail left when they removed the train tracks. I was 12 or 13. I grew up in an extremely rural town, and there were no fast food restaurants. I wanted a cheeseburger. I must have made that 2-hour ride 100 times during my childhood. When I was 10 or 11, my neighbor friend and I dug huge holes in the woods and did countless experiments on the combustibility of various chemicals from our dad's storage sheds. We used our research knowledge to build a working flamethrower using a Super Soaker 100 and a 50-50 mix of diesel and Thompson's water seal. It was glorious until the barrel caught fire, and I threw it the second before it exploded into a pile of melted flaming plastic. We both got some of the molten hot plastic on our arms, which left second-degree burns that we had to hide from our parents until they healed. I got a pair of rollerblades when I was 13. There was nowhere interesting to ride, so I tied a rope to the back rack of a four-wheeler and had my friend pull me down the road at about 30 miles per hour until the heat buildup in the bearings caused them to come apart and my wheels started falling off. I dove into the bank and luckily made it. I was wearing shorts and a short-sleeve shirt. I would have lost a lot of skin had I not reached the bank, where there was grass. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.